Hello guys and panels and dear fans of horror games. This is the second part of the brief history of important horror games. Hope you enjoy it. Go and watch it and then don't forget to like and subscribe. In 2012 we have 4 important horror games. Although all of them weren't successful, but we need to have an explanation about them. One of them is Resident Evil 6. Guys, if you know, this game was more action than being a horror game, and its makers set action survival instead of horror survival. And this caused a lot of negative points and votes about Resident Evil 6. And although it was one of the best games of 2012, but it wasn't so successful in economy. If you have played this game, you know 90% of the game is more action than horror, and just 10% of it is somehow horrible and it doesn't take an eye. After that, I want to mention Resident Evil Revelations 1. When Capcom saw Resident Evil 6 unsuccessful, it tried to revive the Resident Evil. And somehow he did it in Resident Evil Revelations 1. This game makes you somehow feel like lonely and afraid in a big ship. Especially with the new creatures called ooze instead of zombies, and they would suck the character's blood, and it was interesting and horrifying. It used some other elements of horror and it was somehow successful in it. But again, it wasn't the game that Capcom really expected. Now I want to talk about Resident Evil Operation Raccoon City. As I said, Capcom tried to revive Resident Evil after the number 6 of it. So he gave making the game to Slant 6 Games, that is a Canadian studio. Although this game had some negative points, but the studio made a good horror game somehow that was online too, and used some old elements and enemies of horror too. For example, like hunters or tyrants in the game. And although it was successful in economy, but it still wasn't what all the players expected. For example, if I want to tell about the negative points of it, it had some high difficult times in a game. For example, government forces in a game that made it very hard for the player to proceed the game. And especially when you faced and confronted tyrants or hunters, it was really difficult to kill them. So it hadn't a comfortable gameplay, and this caused negative votes for this game. And about positive points, if I want to say, for example, shooting while moving in Resident Evil for the first time, or fast and hard to kill zombies like classic series. But it still wasn't what Capcom and players really expected from a Resident Evil. So they wanted to see something like Resident Evil 4 again. I don't want to talk about this game anymore because our purpose for now is talking generally, not in details. Oh, and before we go to next game, my apology. Resident Evil Raccoon City was before Resident Evil 6, not after it. But the next game I want to talk about is Silent Hill Downpour. As you know, till the date of this video, 31 May 2020, and no more official game was released about this series. And the last game was Silent Hill Downpour that was released in 2012. And although it was somehow successful, but actually it wasn't what players expected as a Silent Hill game. And they wanted to see something like Silent Hill 2 or 3 again. But this game had a change than previous numbers, and it was open world. So you could play some other stories except have the main story of the game. And one of the interesting things in this game was mentioning the Silent Hill 4 story in this game. But as I said again and again, I say it, players really expect from the franchise like Resident Evil or Silent Hill very much higher than this. But generally, this game was successful too, especially it had some other endings. I mean, some endings, several endings in a game, and it made it somehow like the previous numbers. But unfortunately, since the date of that game, 2012 till now, 2020, an official number has never been released. And I will tell you about Silent Hill PT. It was gonna be the next Silent Hill, but it wasn't released because of some problems. In separate records, I'm gonna talk about the continue of Silent Hill series, and I wanna tell you if this game is gonna be continued or not. In 2013, we reached two other important games. One of them is Dead Space 3 that I said I'm gonna have other records about it. Generally, Dead Space 3 wasn't so successful in economy. And here we are, Outlast 1. This game was released in 2013 and is one of the best and hopeful games in horror genre for the fans of horror games. And if you paid enough attention, I told you that Outlast is in the continuous standards of horror games from Amnesia, And when we reach to the criticize of Amnesia, specialized review of Amnesia, I will tell you about the same points of Amnesia, Dark Descent, and Outlast. But generally, I can say that in Amnesia, you are vulnerable against the enemy and you can just run away. And of course, Outlast applied exactly such a system in a game, but with improvement of this standard. And especially the green night vision in this game made it very special and famous. So many of you may know the Outlast game by the night vision camera. But anyway, it was one of the best horror games that made the horror fan gamers very hopeful. And of course, by releasing this game, it caused the fans of Resident Evil disappointed somehow. Because Outlast was a survival horror game, but Resident Evil 6 was more action than a horror survival game. And after that, by coming Evil Within 1, it caused the fans of Resident Evil more disappointed about it. And I'll tell you how Capcom revived Resident Evil franchise. In 2014, we reached two other important horror games, and one of them wasn't released yet. I think all of you know that it is Silent Hill PT, that I will tell you about that. But at first, I want to talk about the other one, Evil Within 1. Actually, when it was released, the games like Resident Evil 6 was more action than a horror game. And because of that, the horror fan players were disappointed because there wasn't a lot of good horror games. And even Resident Evil Revelations 1 couldn't satisfy the players. And also the method of horror in Outlast 1 was different from the Resident Evil franchise. And generally the method of horror in Resident Evil franchise was being forgotten. And Evil Within 1 came with this purpose that the horror games had got more action than horror. And even in an interview with Mr. Shinji Mikami, he said that. Anyway, when this game come, it was really successful and hopefully for horror fans, horror gamers. And although it had some negative points, like for example, sometimes the boss fights like Laura was so hard, but it is one of the best games in horror genre, and of course I advise you to play it at least for once. It is a really good and best horror game. But the other game I want to talk about is Silent Hill PT, and it was never released, and I bet you all know about it. But generally, I can say that somehow it uses the standards of Amnesia Dark Descent. So now you know that's why I always emphasize on Amnesia Dark Descent. But about unreleasing this game, that's all you know. There's not anything new about it that you may all know about it. That there were some problems between Mr. Hideo Kojima and the Konami company, and by leaving Konami by Mr. Kojima, this game was stopped and never built anymore. But you should know that this demo is one of the most downloaded demos in the history of video games. So this shows how incredible it was and it could be. And although there are some rumors that say this game is gonna be built again, but according to official news, looks like it's not so serious. But as you may know, Mr. Kojima said in his tweet that he wants to make the most scary game. And now all the fans of horror games are waiting for this game of Mr. Kojima, and so am I. And I wish the best and success for this perfect mentor and his team, and I hope they make what they want. In 2015 we reached an important game, and actually there was another or so, but it was Resident Evil 1 HD, but it hadn't something new, and it was just a high quality game. But our main topic now is Resident Evil Revelations 2, that you all know it. Look guys, as I said, a lot of players were disappointed from the series of Resident Evil, the franchise of Resident Evil. And so Capcom tried to get the fear back to Resident Evil. Especially after Resident Evil 6 had got a lot of negative votes about horror genre, and also didn't make enough money for Capcom. But in Revelations 2, Capcom was successful about the horror genre in the game, and used some elements of horror very well. Although it had some elements from Resident Evil 6, for example, like the jumping zombies. But generally it was a very good horror game and was released in episodic mode. An interesting point is that for the first time in Resident Evil it had two endings of the game. A good ending and a bad ending. And I don't want to talk about the endings, but generally I can just tell you that it was a good horror game and tried to get the fear back to Resident Evil's series. Although it was successful, but again it wasn't the game that players and Capcom expected. Especially, I guess, for example, on Xbox it had some problems. And it made some players unsatisfied. In 2016, Resident Evil 0 that was released in 2002 was remastered to HD graphics. It hadn't something new and just was remastered into HD graphics. So that's good for playing nowadays. And then now we reached the year 2017 that there were three important horror games released. One of them was Resident Evil 7. Actually, I wanted to talk to you about how Capcom revived Resident Evil franchise, and now this is that moment. With Resident Evil 7, Capcom did it. Although Revelations 1 and 2 were good, but they weren't exactly what players expected again. So, to revive the franchise, Capcom made some big changes and made some risks in a way that when the game was released, no one would believe that this is the Resident Evil. The first change in the first look was the first person camera. Because for the first time in main numbers of Resident Evil, for example, like 1, 2, 3, or so on, the first person camera was used. I'm gonna have separate records and explanation about when and where we use first person camera or third person camera, so you will know about the rules of it. Now I'm gonna talk about the Resident Evil 7 generally, and I don't get into details a lot, and just totally I wanna tell you, for example, Resident Evil 7 was a reboot for this franchise. Well, at first you need to know the meaning of boot. Boot means some things that are basic and very important in a game that make it separate from the other games. For example, in Resident Evil, if we don't have any zombie or any virus, it won't be something like Resident Evil franchise. Maybe it's another game. And if someone don't tell us about it, we won't understand that this is Resident Evil, because there's no zombie, there is no virus in it, and it looks like another game. So, for example, for Resident Evil, the boots are zombie and virus. But in Resident Evil that is a reboot, for example, we have still virus, and this boot has not been changed, but we don't have zombie, and this boot has been changed, and this is the cause we call it a reboot. And more than that, it got somehow like a supernatural game. It had some supernatural elements in it, like Mia and Evelyn. But if you know, in previous numbers we didn't have any supernatural elements, so this is a reboot in this view too. And I think this element somehow got from Resident Evil 3.5, that was a beta version for Resident Evil 4, but what they decided to use it in this number, and it was a really good decision. In Resident Evil 7, some old elements from the previous numbers were used. For example, like the big bag, that you could use it for saving your sources and your ammos, your, for example, health packs in it. Just like the numbers 1, 2, and 3. For saving the game, you had to use a broadcast that was something like old typewriter in numbers 1 through 4. The amount of your life was shown like the numbers 1, 2, and 3. And generally, these and other old elements that were used in Resident Evil 7 were one of the important causes of success of Resident Evil 7. Another important reason was focusing on survival horror, exactly opposite to the previous number that was focusing on action and survival. In this number, you couldn't do a lot of actions like number 6, and maybe the most thing you could do was just using a knife and nothing more. The next important tip is using the elements like one of the most nostalgic numbers of this franchise, I mean Resident Evil 4. For example, you had to use three dog headstones for the entrance door of the mansion to open it. That was something like Resident Evil 4 when you were stuck in Salazar Palace. Or we had Baker's family like the zombies in Resident Evil 4, that they could talk or, for example, behave like usual humans, but actually they were zombies. And Baker's family were exactly like the zombies of Resident Evil 4. Alright, guys, I don't want to talk about this game anymore. And if it was necessary, I will have separate records about this game too. But now let's get to the next game. The next game is Outlast 2 in 2017. Red Barrels made Outlast 2 when he saw the first number so successful. And of course, it is one of the best horror games, and has some, I mean, of course, it has some negative points, but it is one of the best horror games, and my advice is to play it at least for once. Tip 1 is more horror and violence in this number than number 1. For example, it had some enemies like boss, and one of them, for example, is like the tall old woman that you confronted her at the first seconds of the game. Tip 2 that is a negative point is a lower artificial smart intelligence than number 1. For example, it doesn't matter how hard you try to hide from the boss-like enemies in the game, like that tall old woman, because they're gonna find you anyway. And in most of the times, whatever you do, they find you. And I guess it is one of the programming problems. Or, for example, another example, some enemies, when they saw you, they behaved as if they didn't see you, or they don't see you. And it is, as I said, it is, I guess, one of the programming problems. But it makes the game less horrible, and it is not good. The tip 3 is unclear story. I mean, you cannot understand the story completely, and especially at the end. It ends so unclear and hazy, and you may not understand about it. Tip 4 is more availability of batteries in the game than number 1. In number 1, if you hadn't enough batteries, you couldn't continue the game. But in number 2, you can find more batteries, and it somehow makes the game less horrible. But a new tip is that there are some bandages in the game that you need them to revitalize yourself, and or I mean reviving or revitalize yourself, and it's somehow better than number 1. For example, in number 1, it didn't matter how much you are injured. You could step aside and stay and wait, and you will revitalize. But in number 2, you need bandages for revitalizing yourself. And somehow it made up the more availability of batteries, because these bandages were few in the game and you needed to use them wisely. Tip 5 is compulsory recording and filming in some special places and moments in the game. Exactly opposite the number 1, that it was optional in a game and you could record or not. And in number 2, when you put the pieces of recordings together, you will understand the story very better. But another very important tip that I ask you to pay a lot attention is appropriate and on-time jump score in this game. And one of the reasons of success of this game is this. So I'm gonna have separate records about the rules of jump scares in the game. Because of this, unfortunately, because of this, many people and many players got wrong ideas about the horror games. For example, you're in a dark place and suddenly something jumps at you, and many people call these games the horror games. Look, actually, jump scares have special rules about them in horror games. And unfortunately, many people, and especially new studios, expect to succeed only by using this formulation. And more unfortunately, they get disappointed when they don't succeed by using this element in their game. Of course, you need to know the rules of an element, then you can use it appropriately in your game. And you may use a lot of jump scares in your game, and it makes it horrible somehow, but it doesn't mean that your game is gonna be successful, so you need to know the rules. For example, companies like Capcom that use jump scares in games like Resident Evil or Red Barrels use jump scares in Outlast, they just they don't just come and use something horrible as jump scare in the game, because they have rules for the use of jump scares. And of course, jump scares in Resident Evil are very different from jump scares in Outlast. So I will make separate records for jump scare rules, that if you wanna make a horror game, you know these rules and be successful in your game. The next game we're gonna talk about is Evil Within 2 that was released in 2017. And just in case, I wanted to tell you that the director of this game is Mr. John Jonas, not Mr. Shinji Mikami. And he added more positive points and elements to this game, plus the last number, and caused this number of the game so successful too. And of course, it had some negative points, but it was a really good horror game. And my advice is to play it for sure. But I wanted to talk about the tips of this game generally. The places of this game are more similar to each other than the last number. For example, in number 1, several places like hospital, village, and other places, or maybe castle, are used for the game. But in this number, number 2, city areas are more used. For example, in STEM, or it's an environment like Matrix, if you know, in STEM there are different computers that you can use them to transport to the different places of the level, but they are the city, there are like city areas too. Most of the places are like city areas, and more similar to each other than the last number. Another tip is that the action part of the game is somehow more bold than the horror of it. And it is somehow more exciting than horror. But of course, it is still a horror game because of the horror elements used in it very well. And since the first seconds of the game, you confront the enemies that are like more like bosses than the usual enemies, and it makes it so exciting and of course so horrible. The story is more emotional than last number, and the personality of characters are better written in this number. Exactly opposite the last number. And maybe that's why when I heard the votes about the game, the players would say that the number 1 is more horrible than number 2. And when we wanted to talk about Evil Within, have a special review on Evil Within 1 and 2, I will tell you more tips in there, and I will tell you why the number 2 is somehow uh, less horrible than number 1. So you should pay enough attention when you reach the game. And of course, I'm waiting for number 3 too. Then we reached two other important horror games that both of them were remake, and you all know them. One of them is Resident Evil 2 remake, and another one is Resident Evil 3 remake that is released in 2020. This date of this video. And many people said the number 2 was a really good remake, especially in horror genre, and number 3 wasn't very good as a remake. And as I said, I'm gonna have separate records about the uh, words of remake, reboot, remaster, and reimagination. And about this, I'm gonna talk in there and say why number 2 was good but number 3 wasn't. I'm gonna tell you about the tips of them and where to make remake, where to make a reboot, where to make a reimagination, and I'm gonna explain it for you. So I'll be waiting for you in that videos and your votes about it. And I wanted to thank you for watching this video till the end, and thanks for your attention. As I said, I just reviewed the important horror games in this brief story. Not every horror game, and if you're familiar with this Steam environment, you can see a lot of horror games that are being produced by a lot of people or new studios every day, and we are not gonna talk about all of them. And I think I've said it before. And if I wanted to talk about these games, I had to, for example, like Visage, I had to say the tips of them again, because their tips were the same as, like, for example, Amnesia, Dark Descent, or Silent Hill PT. If you want a special game to be reviewed, to have a special review about them, you can say them in comments. And of course, I will have a special review about the games you like, and more liked games will be in more priority than the lower liked games. But the most priority is with the game currently being special reviewed. Another tip is that I upload the videos at first in Upload and then in YouTube, because in YouTube, it's an uh, international environment for uploading and downloading the videos. So I upload the videos in there with English subtitle or voice, and it takes somehow more time to upload the videos. But if you are a Persian, you have a Persian language, you are a Persian language guy, so you can go in Apparat, and if you are not, you can watch the videos in YouTube. And maybe I upload some extra videos in YouTube, and because the rules of YouTube and Apparat are different from each other. There isn't any more tip right now actually, and thanks for watching. Till the next video, goodbye.